The sky over occupied France was strangely quiet in the late afternoon light, the kind of silence that settles just before something breaks. Inside the cramped cockpit of an American fighter, a young pilot steadied his breath, listening to the low thunder of his engine echo through the metal around him. Sweat mixed with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the distant glint of returning bombers traced a thin, fragile line toward home. He was only 23, 2 months in combat, one confirmed victory. And yet, on that day, he carried the weight of a machine many believed was too heavy, too sluggish, too unforgiving for a knife-edged war in the sky. The aircraft beneath him, massive, powerful, doubted by nearly everyone, had already taken good men and never given them back. But war does not wait for perfection. It demands faith in whatever steel is under your hands. And as the sun dipped lower, that young pilot was about to face a moment no training manual could prepare him for. A moment that would test not only his courage, but the true nature of the most underrated American fighter plane of World War II. The question was simple, brutal, and immediate when everything fell apart. Would this airplane keep him alive? Before that fateful afternoon over France, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt began far from the front lines, in noisy American factories, and on airfields that were never meant to handle a machine of its size. It was an American fighter plane unlike anything the nation had ever built. 10,000 pounds of metal before ammunition or fuel, driven by a massive Pratt & Whitney engine that shook the ground when it roared to life. On paper, it was a powerhouse. In practice, many pilots wondered whether brute strength alone could keep them alive in the unforgiving world of World War II aviation. The first to fly it in combat training were the men of the 56th Fighter Group. They received early production Thunderbolts. In the summer of 1942, machines still rough around the edges, still hiding flaws no manual had fully explained. Their home base at Bridgeport, Connecticut was completely inadequate for such an aircraft. Runways, too short approaches, too tight, and no margin for error. What followed was a season of fear and loss. Engines failed without warning. Control systems locked up. The big fighter behaved nothing like the lighter trainers the pilots knew. 18 young aviators died before they ever saw the enemy. 41 aircraft were destroyed. And each crash left behind a question that no one dared voice aloud. Was this American fighter plane truly ready for war? Yet war offered no alternative. When the Thunderbolt finally reached England in early 1943, the Luftwaffe dominated the airspace over Europe. German fighters, the agile Bf-109 and the ferocious FW-190 could twist, climb, and turn with a predatory grace that the heavier P-47 simply could not match. To counter this, American tacticians wrote a doctrine built on speed and altitude dive in from above fire, in a single decisive burst climb back to safety. No turning fights, no prolonged duels. The Thunderbolt was a weapon of momentum, not maneuver. But doctrine is a fragile thing in the chaos of real combat. Clouds, timing. Sun angles, the unpredictable instincts of enemy pilots. All of it conspired to force young Americans into fights they were never meant to win. The rules of engagement looked clean in the briefing room. Over occupied Europe, they dissolved into instinct and desperation. The men of the 56th Fighter Group knew this better than anyone. They had watched friends vanish into the channel or fall burning over farmland, their thunderbolts twisting toward the earth in ways no theory could explain. Among the officers trying to make sense of this brutal new reality was Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke. Older than most of his men, hardened by years of flying, he carried with him a lesson learned while observing the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain doctrine must bend or men will break. What mattered in the air was not the perfect plan, but the willingness to adapt faster than the enemy. And soon under Zemke's command, the 56th Fighter Group would begin to rethink everything they thought they knew about the P-47 Thunderbolt, because the war was about to prove in blood and steel that its greatest strength had been hiding in plain sight. The turning point arrived on June 26, 1943, high above occupied France. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group stretched across the sky in loose formation, a shield of American fighter planes guarding the wounded B-17s as they limped home from their bombing run near Paris. The air was sharp and thin at 19,000 feet. Sunlight slanted across the cockpit glass in a way that made spotting enemies nearly impossible. And at the very back of the formation, tail end, Charlie flew Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the most vulnerable man in the most vulnerable position. He scanned the sky again and again, searching the empty blue behind him. Nothing. Then everything happened at once. 16 Feldjagd-190s came dropping out of the sun-sleeked German Predators, diving from 25,000 feet with the confidence of hunters who knew the terrain. Before Johnson could finish calling a warning over the radio cannon, shells exploded through his canopy. Plexiglass shattered. Hydraulic fluid burst across his face like scalding rain. A machine gun round tore his oxygen mask away. Another split the skin of his leg. In the space of seconds, the cockpit became a storm of glass, smoke, blood, and fire. The P-47 snapped into an inverted spin. No control, no oxygen. Flames licked at the edges of the cockpit as the massive machine tumbled like a piece of scrap metal hurled from the heavens. Johnson kicked the rudder, braced his boots, tried to slide the canopy back to bail out, but the mechanism was dead, melted, useless. He was trapped in a burning American fighter plane with no way out and nowhere to go but down. Somewhere in the chaos, Johnson stopped fighting. For a brief moment, he simply accepted the quiet truth that every combat pilot knows but rarely faces head-on. This might be the end. He thought about Barbara, the life waiting for him across an ocean, the life he would not return to. And then, without warning, the fire went out. Starved of oxygen in the violent spin, the flames collapsed and died. Johnson wiped enough hydraulic fluid from his eyes to see shadows again. He kicked hard left, pulled the stick back, and the P-47's nose clawed upward. By 8,000 feet, the Thunderbolt leveled off. Bleeding, half-blind, barely holding together, but alive. He turned toward the English coast, pushing the throttle forward, trusting the big Pratt & Whitney engine to keep running, despite the punishment it had taken. And that was when a single FW-190 eased up alongside him. The German pilot stared at the mangled Thunderbolt, as if puzzled that such a wreck was still in the air. Then he slid behind Johnson and opened fire again. Hundreds of rounds slammed into the P-47's wings, and fuselage a metallic scream echoing through the cockpit. Johnson hunched behind the armored seat, waiting for the moment when something essential engine Spartail would finally give way. It never did. The German made pass after pass, each one a deliberate attempt to finish the job. But the Thunderbolt refused to break. Metal tore, fabric shredded, but the airplane kept flying steady toward England as if powered by something more stubborn than steel. On his final pass out of ammunition, the German pilot formed up beside Johnson one last time. He rocked his wings, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, and turned back toward France. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the American fighter plane, so many had doubted had survived the impossible. When Robert Johnson slid his shattered P-47 Thunderbolt onto the grass at RAF Manston, the silence that followed was almost unreal. Ground crew pried him from the cockpit. His hands still locked around the stick, his legs refusing to move. Only later, when the adrenaline finally bled away, did he learn the scale of what the airplane had endured. 21 cannon strikes, more than 200 machine gun hits, every major surface damaged. Yet the war was rarely so merciful. On that same mission, June 26, 1943, another pilot from the 56th Fighter Group, Lieutenant Roger Dearnever, returned. Dyer had been one of the most naturally gifted aviators of his class. A man who had survived the deadly training period back in Connecticut, survived the near supersonic dive experiment, survived every lesson the P-47 had forced upon young Americans, learning how to fight in a machine built for power, not grace. But on this day in the same sky against the same German attackers, Dear was shot down over France. The difference between survival and death often came down to seconds angles, or the invisible luck that decides whether a shell strikes the engine, the fuel tank, or harmless metal. Johnson's American fighter plane absorbed the damage. Dear's did not. It was a truth every pilot carried with him. You could do everything right and still never make it home. The losses weighed heavily on the 56th Fighter Group. By mid-1943, statistics painted a bleak picture. Young men arrived fresh from training, flew a handful of missions, and disappeared before gaining real combat experience. The official explanations, pilot error, improper use of doctrine, felt hollow. The men who survived knew combat was far messier than theory. German aces exploited every mistake, every moment of hesitation. And the Thunderbolt, for all its power, required a kind of discipline no manual had fully explained. This was the crucible in which Hubert Zemk made his stand as a commander. Instead of accepting losses as inevitable, he pushed his unit to study, adapt, and evolve. Every mission ended with long, unfiltered discussions. Who succeeded today? Who didn't and why? The answers revealed an uncomfortable truth. The pilots who rigidly followed the hit-and-run doctrine were often the ones getting shot down. They made one pass, climbed away, and left themselves exposed. The pilots who survived and scored kills were those who trusted the P-47 Thunderbolt's raw power enough to stay in the fight, diving and climbing in vertical maneuvers that played to the aircraft's strengths. Little by little, the unit's thinking changed. The Thunderbolt wasn't a delicate duelist. It was a force of momentum. It could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe fielded. It could take damage that would tear a German fighter apart. And it could hammer enemies with 850 caliber guns in the brief windows when a firing solution appeared. As 1943 wore on, the results became impossible to ignore. Kill ratios improved. Veteran German pilots began to note with frustration that Thunderbolt units were fighting differently, more aggressively, more confidently, more unpredictably. The aircraft hadn't changed. The understanding had. And from that understanding came a new truth, one proven in the skies day after day. When flown with energy, teamwork, and tactical imagination, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just survivable, it was deadly. As 1944 unfolded, the air war over Europe changed, and the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt changed with it. The sleek P-51 Mustang, with its long range and elegant lines, took over the deep escort missions into Germany. That shift freed the Thunderbolt for a new purpose, one that would define its legacy more profoundly than any dogfight. The American fighter plane that had once been judged too heavy for aerial duels became the most feared ground attack weapon in the European theater. German troops gave these aircraft a single name: Jabos, fighter bombers, low, fast, merciless, the same attributes that kept the Thunderbolt alive in air combat: its rugged airframe, its air-cooled radial engine, its sheer structural strength made it devastating against ground targets. Trains vanished in explosions of steam and steel. Truck convoys scattered under the roar of 850 caliber guns. Armored vehicles were cracked open by 5-inch rockets that punched through plate and tore into ammunition stores. A single pass from a Thunderbolt could erase an entire column from the map. For the German army, the consequences were catastrophic. Their logistics depended on daylight rail movement on long supply lines, feeding distant fronts. But by late 1944, any train that moved under the sun risked annihilation. P-47. Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks, and choked the arteries of the Wehrmacht until entire units withered for lack of fuel, ammunition, or food. No grand strategy succeeds when its supplies die on the rails, and the Thunderbolt ensured exactly that. Across the Atlantic, American commanders recognized what this shift meant. The P-47 was no longer merely an aircraft competing with German fighters. It had become a strategic tool, reshaping the battlefield from the ground up. And yet public perception back home rarely mirrored this reality. The Mustang captured headlines and admiration with its polished silhouette and record-setting escort missions. The Thunderbolt, bulky and brutal, did the hard work in silence. But for those who fought the war, the truth was unmistakable. Luftwaffe reports from late 1943 and 1944 reveal growing frustration, not only with American tactics, but with the increasing difficulty of shaking Thunderbolt pilots once they committed to an attack. German replacements were inexperienced, their veteran aces dwindling. Meanwhile, the 56 Fighter Group and others like it refined their methods, building a culture of tactical innovation that outpaced the Luftwaffe's ability to adapt. After the war, many nations, from South America to Europe to the Middle East, purchased surplus Thunderbolts, trusting the same durability that had saved so many American pilots. The aircraft's design philosophy echoed into the jet age through machines like the F-84, F-105, F-4 Phantom. Even the A-10 Warthog, big, tough, heavily armed, built not for elegance but for survival and firepower. In the eyes of the world, that was the true legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. A reminder that power, resilience, and the will to adapt can change the course of a war. In the years after the war, Robert Johnson rarely spoke about June 26, 1943. He lived a quiet life, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, worked an ordinary job in an ordinary town. To those around him, he was a husband, a father, a neighbor. Only a few understood that he had once ridden a crippled American fighter plane through fire and steel and brought it home when no aircraft should have survived. His story remained etched not in grand speeches, but in the silence of a man who carried memory with the humility of someone who had seen too much. That silence mirrored the fate of the P-47 Thunderbolt itself. History remembered the sleek lines of the Mustang, the glamour of long-range escort missions, the photographs that looked good in newspapers. But the most underrated American combat plane of World War II left its mark in ways less visible and far more enduring. It survived hits no other fighter could survive. It tore apart German logistics. It carried its pilots home again and again when luck and physics said it should not. And it proved beyond statistics or legend that raw strength paired with the right tactics could rewrite the rules of air combat. The 56th Fighter Group understood this better than anyone. They discovered that mastery comes not from having the perfect machine, but from understanding the one you have, its limited strengths, its hidden gifts, and using them with discipline, bravery, and imagination. Their pilots trusted the Thunderbolt not because it was beautiful, but because it was faithful. In war, faithfulness can matter more than elegance. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson the P-47 leaves behind. Wars are not won by flawless technology or heroic myth alone. They are won by people who adapt faster than the enemy, who learn from failure, who take imperfect tools and turn them into decisive instruments. They are won by leaders who listen, by crews who keep engines alive through the night, by pilots who climb into battered cockpits knowing the odds and flying anyway. So the question now passes to us: what truly made the P-47 Thunderbolt great, the machine itself or the people who refused to quit on it? If stories like this speak to you, if they remind you of the courage and cost behind every page of history, consider joining us. Like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Every voice in this community helps keep these stories alive, because history only fades when we allow it to be forgotten. The battle may be over, but the legacy of the Thunderbolt, the most faithful of America's wartime fighters, still echoes in the sky. The morning haze clung to the earth like a final warning, drifting through the cold air as engines growled awake across a field of steel. Diesel fumes mixed with the smell of wet soil, settling over rows of armored giants waiting in silence for the order to move. In that brief pause before the storm, every man understood that the next few moments could redraw the line between life and memory. Somewhere within that formation, one crew prepared their machine with a ritual precision born not from fear, but from the knowledge that hesitation cost lives on this front. They had seen how quickly the battlefield could shift, how the distance between hunter and hunted could collapse in seconds. And today, looming beyond the tree line, the enemy waited with weapons designed to outrange and outgun anything America could field. What drives a man to advance into that kind of fire, knowing the math of survival rarely favors him? What gives a crew the resolve to push forward when the wiser choice might be to hold back? As the engines roared and the ground trembled beneath 30 tons of moving armor, the answer to those questions would reveal itself in ways no doctrine had ever predicted. Before the first shot ever crossed the hedgerows of Normandy, the imbalance between American armor and German heavy tanks was already an undeniable truth. The Sherman was fast, reliable, and easy to repair, but it had been designed for a different kind of war, one where mobility mattered more than brute strength. On the Western Front of 1944, however, strength ruled. The Panthers and Tigers that guarded the German lines were built to dominate at long range, turning open fields into killing grounds where American crews rarely had the luxury of choosing how to fight. American doctrine tried to solve this mismatch with theory. Sherman units were taught to maneuver, to avoid frontal duels, to rely on numbers and artillery support. On paper, it made sense. In the chaos of the bocage, it did not. The hedgerows blocked lines of sight. Roads funneled tanks into predictable kill zones. And every moment spent searching for a flank was a moment when a German gunner could draw a bead on a moving silhouette. Crews quickly learned that doctrine rarely survived contact. They needed something more immediate, more instinctive, something that could bridge the gap between survival and catastrophe. That need shaped the men who would come to define a new way of fighting. Training had taught them the mechanics of their machine, but combat would teach them its soul. Drivers learned to feel the track tension through their boots. Gunners learned to judge a firing solution in the blink of an eye. Loaders memorized the weight of each round and the rhythm of the gun. In a Sherman, survival depended on turning 5 separate tasks into a single act, fast, fluid, and fearless. The first test came near Villers-Fossard, where a German Panther lay concealed behind a hedgerow, its gun already pointed toward the field where American armor approached. Most crews would have hesitated, waiting for artillery or reinforcements. But hesitation in Normandy had already cost too many lives. Instead, the American tank advanced into the engagement, choosing aggression over caution. The opening shot missed, kicking up soil in front of the German position. The Panther returned fire with a scream of high-velocity steel, its round slicing past the advancing Sherman. Each exchange brought the two machines closer, shrinking the range where German armor held the advantage. At less than 400 yards, The American crew executed a sharp maneuver, swinging the hull just enough to expose the gun toward the Panther's flank. The shot that followed tore through the enemy's side armor, erupting in a burst of internal fire and pressure that blew the turret skyward. It was the first of many victories, but more importantly, it was proof that courage, speed, and precision could rewrite the assumptions of armored warfare. That opening clash marked the true beginning of a new approach, one born not from textbooks, but from necessity, shaped by men who refused to let the limitations of their machine define their fate. Momentum on the Western Front shifted not through grand strategies, but through countless small decisions made under fire. For the crew that had learned to trust instinct over doctrine, this became their greatest weapon. Each engagement refined their method: move first, shoot fast, close the distance before the enemy could bring its superior guns to bear. What began as a desperate experiment soon became a pattern that others in the division noticed. Near St. Lo, that pattern turned into something extraordinary. In a landscape crushed by artillery and cut into fragments by hedgerows, the crew faced a mixed German column attempting to regroup. Instead of waiting for infantry to clear the road, they pushed forward, catching half-tracks and tanks clustered along a narrow road. The fight lasted minutes. When the smoke settled, 3 tanks and 15 armored vehicles lay destroyed. It was a brutal example of aggression outpacing preparation, of speed denying the enemy the chance to react. 2 weeks later near Mortain, their resolve was tested again. A pair of Panthers had set an ambush using elevation and concealment to dominate the approach. Under conventional tactics, the Americans should have pulled back. Instead, they surged forward, forcing the Panthers to fire hastily at a closing target. A slight shift in angle, a brief flash of exposed side armor, and the American gunner found his mark. One Panther erupted, then the other. What should have been a killing ground became another narrow escape. These victories were not luck. They were the result of a crew functioning with near surgical coordination. The driver anticipated terrain before the commander spoke. The gunner tracked targets even as the tank lurched over broken earth. The loader moved with the rhythm of a machine he understood better than himself. In those moments, the Sherman was no longer a collection of steel plates and rivets. It was a single organism, shaped by shared experience and held together by trust. Word of their method spread through the 3rd Armored Division. Crews who had watched Shermans burn in Normandy now looked for ways to replicate the aggressive style they had once considered reckless. Reports from German units noted the change. American tanks pressing forward despite being hit, refusing to retreat, forcing engagements at close range where the advantages of German armor narrowed. It was an unexpected shift that unsettled veteran panzer crews. By late August, their record had grown into something unprecedented. 12 tanks destroyed. Hundreds of armored vehicles knocked out or abandoned. Columns shattered before they could form defensive lines. And all of it accomplished in a machine the enemy dismissed as inferior. At the height of their success, the crew was no longer simply surviving battles. They were shaping them. Their actions demonstrated that initiative, bold, immediate, and fearless, could overturn the assumptions of armored warfare. For a brief moment in that turbulent summer of 1944, they showed what was possible when 5 men refused to let the odds decide their fate. As summer gave way to the colder winds of September, the war's pace showed no mercy, even to crews who had survived against impossible odds. After months of continuous combat, the order finally arrived. The crew was to return to the United States for a war bond tour. For the first time since Normandy, the men allowed themselves to imagine a future not shaped by daily risk. It was a fragile hope, but on the Western Front, hope was a rare commodity. Their final mission before rotation was meant to be routine, an advance near the Siegfried Line, with strict instructions that they were not to take the lead. The battalion commander feared losing them so close to safety. But war rarely respects careful planning. Positions that appeared quiet concealed threats, waiting for a single mistake. That mistake came in the form of unfamiliar hands. Their regular loader, a man whose timing had become second nature to the crew, had already been sent to the rear for medical checks. In his place stood a young replacement who had never fought alongside them. He knew the procedure, but not the rhythm, not the instinctive flow that held the crew together. On a battlefield where seconds mattered more than armor thickness, that difference proved fatal. As the tank advanced past a damaged house, the commander spotted the outline of an 88mm gun, one of the most feared weapons in Germany's arsenal. He called the target. The gunner aligned the sights. The order to fire echoed through the turret. And then the round jammed. A single, misloaded shell froze the gun at the worst possible moment, leaving the Sherman blind and exposed. The German crew reacted instantly. The flash of the 88mm muzzle cut through the morning haze, followed by a blast that tore into the turret. The shell passed between two crewmen and detonated inside, ripping steel and flesh with the same indifference. The explosion hurled the commander out of the hatch, shattering his leg and knocking the breath from his lungs as he hit the earth. Inside the tank, fire and smoke swallowed the compartment. The driver and bow gunner were dragged out alive, dazed and burned but breathing. The gunner was gravely wounded, pinned by shrapnel. The replacement loader, still barely a man, was killed instantly. Medics reached the commander as he tried, through sheer will, to stop the bleeding from what remained of his leg. They gave him morphine, applied tourniquets, and pulled him back from the edge of shock. But no amount of skill could undo what had been lost in that single exchange of fire. In the quiet that followed, the cost of their campaign finally revealed itself, not in the number of enemy vehicles destroyed, but in the shattered bodies and the empty space where a crewman once stood. Victory had defined their summer. Now consequence defined its end. In the months that followed, analysts within the Army began to examine what had happened on the Western Front, not just in terms of victories, but in terms of the adaptation that had made those victories possible. The mismatch between the Sherman and German heavy armor was no longer theoretical. It was a daily reality that commanders and crews had been forced to confront. And yet, in that imbalance, new ideas had taken root. What some called recklessness, others recognized as innovation born from necessity. For military planners, the actions of certain Sherman crews highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Doctrine had lagged behind the battlefield. The rigid belief that tanks should avoid close combat with Panthers and Tigers had collapsed under the weight of real engagements. Reports from the 3rd Armored Division showed that initiative, swift, aggressive, and unpredictable, had become the only practical counter to German firepower. Across the front, officers quietly adjusted tactics, encouraging crews to exploit mobility at distances where German optics and long-barrel guns offered less certainty. Historians later noted that these battlefield lessons contributed to the evolution of American armor in the final year of the war. Improvements in the Sherman, combined with the eventual arrival of the M26 Pershing, reflected a growing recognition that American industry needed to produce tanks capable of meeting heavy armor head-on. But those machines came too late for the men who had spent 1944 fighting with what was available, relying on ingenuity more than equipment. From a broader perspective, the story resonated far beyond military analysis. To American audiences, it became an example of how ordinary soldiers had shaped the outcome of the war through determination rather than technological advantage. To German veterans, it demonstrated how even superior machines could be overcome by relentless pressure and unorthodox tactics. And to scholars of armored warfare, it became a case study in how adaptation occurs not through committees, but through the actions of individuals who refuse to accept the limits placed before them. In the end, the legacy left behind was not simply a tally of destroyed vehicles. It was a reminder that doctrine is only a starting point, and that on the battlefield, survival often belongs to those willing to rewrite the rules in real time. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the stories of armored combat faded into the background of a world eager to rebuild. Yet some stories refused to disappear, carried forward by veterans who remembered the men who had fought beside them. Among those memories were accounts of crews who changed the tempo of battle, who stepped into the narrow space between survival and defeat, and proved that resolve could matter as much as steel. For one American crew, the war lasted only 81 days. But the imprint they left on the battlefield stretched far beyond that brief span. What they accomplished was never simply about numbers or tallies. It was about the willingness to confront superior firepower with speed, intuition, and an unbreakable bond among five men who understood that each decision they made carried the weight of all their lives. The commander who had led them returned home with scars that reshaped every step he took. Physical wounds were only part of the cost. Like many veterans of armored combat, he carried the quieter burden of memory, the faces of the men he saved and the one he lost, the echo of decisions made in seconds that remained with him for decades. Yet he kept moving forward, working with machines, teaching others, finding purpose in the simple rhythm of everyday life. His legacy was preserved not through speeches or memoirs, but through the crews who adopted his methods, the historians who studied his battles, and the training halls that carried his name. It lived on in the idea that courage in war is rarely loud. More often, it is the silent choice to act when hesitation would be easier. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson left behind. That history is shaped not only by the weapons a nation builds, but by the individuals who refuse to yield when circumstance turns against them. That even in the shadow of more powerful enemies, ingenuity and determination can tip the balance. As we look back on that summer of 1944, we are reminded that the cost of every mile gained was paid in human lives, and that the men who fought those battles deserve more than footnotes. They deserve to be remembered. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing your thoughts below. What lessons do you think modern warfare still carries from those fields in Europe? And if you'd like to continue exploring these hidden chapters of military history, we invite you to join us for the next story. The morning sky over Europe was strangely quiet before the first engines rose from the horizon. A German officer later recalled looking up and feeling as if the heavens themselves were made of steel, layer upon layer of American bombers, stretching beyond sight. It was a vision of industrial power so vast that it seemed impossible only a few years earlier. To understand how such overwhelming force became reality, we have to turn back to a moment far removed from the battlefield, a quiet office in Detroit, May 1940. William Knudsen, president of General Motors, held a telegram from Washington. In it, President Roosevelt demanded something the world believed America could never deliver: an industrial surge capable of producing 50,000 military aircraft a year. At the time, American aircraft production barely reached 3,000 planes annually. Germany dismissed Roosevelt's goal as empty propaganda. Their intelligence reports insisted the United States lacked the workforce, the tooling, and the engineering culture required for true industrial warfare. They were wrong. What followed was a transformation that would shape the arsenal of democracy, ignite factories like the Willow Run bomber factory, and flood the skies with machines that would change the course of World War II. But behind those numbers lies a deeper question. How did a nation that seemed unprepared become the greatest air power manufacturer in history? When Roosevelt issued his call in May 1940, the world was already slipping into darkness. France was collapsing. Belgium and the Netherlands had fallen in rapid succession. British forces were being pushed toward the sea. Across the Atlantic, the United States possessed fewer than 3,000 military aircraft, a number so small that senior officers quietly wondered whether the nation could defend its own shores, let alone influence a global war. In the cold arithmetic of military power, American aircraft production seemed irrelevant. Yet Roosevelt's demand for 50,000 aircraft a year was not merely a strategic calculation. It was a recognition that industrial might, if properly organized, could determine the fate of nations. But to German intelligence, the proposal was laughable. Their analysts compiled reports insisting America was a land of farmers and automobile workers, not an engine of industrial warfare. They calculated that even under ideal conditions, the United States might reach 10,000 aircraft a year by 1942. Anything more, they said, was fantasy. These assessments were not entirely unreasonable. American aircraft factories in 1939 resembled craft workshops more than modern production lines. At companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, skilled teams built aircraft one at a time, hand-fitting components, shaping metal by feel, and adjusting every part until it matched. Precision existed, but scale did not. There were no moving assembly lines, no interchangeable parts, and no system capable of multiplying output by tens of thousands. Germany saw this and concluded American aircraft production could never threaten the Luftwaffe. But in Detroit, one man recognized what the Germans had missed. Charles Sorensen Ford Motor Company's master of production understood that assembly lines were not bound by the product they built. They were bound by process. He had watched the automobile shift from craft guilds to mass production, a revolution that turned the Model T into the most manufactured machine in human history. To Sorensen, the idea that aircraft could not be mass-produced was a failure of imagination, not engineering. His turning point came during a visit to Consolidated Aircraft's B-24 plant in San Diego. Sorensen walked the factory floor and saw workers building one bomber a day, measuring by hand, drilling by hand, filing edges to make mismatched parts fit. It reminded him not of modern industry, but of the world before Henry Ford's assembly line. That night in a hotel room at the Coronado, he spread sketches across the table. He imagined breaking the B-24 into sub-assemblies, standardizing every piece and designing tooling capable of producing identical components hour after hour. What emerged on paper was radical, a system that could produce one B-24 every single hour. It was an idea so ambitious that even aircraft executives laughed. But Sorensen knew what few understood in 1940, that America's strength was not in what it was building, but in what it could build. His plan would soon give rise to the Willow Run Bomber Factory, a place destined to become the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. And facing him was the most important question of all: would the nation trust him enough to try? The decision to build the Willow Run Bomber Factory marked the beginning of one of the largest industrial experiments in human history. Located on farmland west of Detroit, the site looked ordinary at first glance, just fields, trees, and the quiet bend of Willow Run Creek. But within months, that landscape transformed into a structure so vast that workers joked it looked less like a building and more like a continent under a single roof. Albert Kahn, the architect, who had designed Ford's most ambitious plans, was tasked with creating something unprecedented. The result was a 3.5 million square foot L-shaped facility with a mile-long assembly line and a 90-degree turn engineered directly into the building. The roof covered 78 acres. Inside, thousands of machine tools, weighted the shape of aluminum into the bones of a bomber. Outside, a dedicated airport with 6 runways and massive hangars allowed aircraft to be flown moments after completion. It was not merely a factory, it was a city power station, fire department, medical facilities, cafeterias, bus terminals built for one purpose: to change the future of American aircraft production. But size alone did not equal success. By late 1941 and early 1942, Willow Run's scale seemed to work against it. Workers struggled with aluminum, a metal that demanded delicacy unfamiliar to automobile teams. Tooling crushed parts. Tolerances were off by fractions of an inch that mattered in flight but not on highways. Engineering changes from the military arrived constantly, forcing Ford to halt sections of the line and rebuild equipment. Month after month, the output remained the same: 0 completed bombers. Newspapers mocked the effort, calling it "Will It Run" instead of "Willow Run." Congressional investigators questioned whether Ford had overreached. Even seasoned managers wondered if Sorensen's vision had been a step too far. But for the workers on the floor, the failure felt personal. A poorly driven rivet on a car might mean a warranty claim. A flaw in a bomber could mean 10 lives lost over Europe. That responsibility forged a sense of purpose inside the factory, quiet, heavy, and unmistakable. Sorensen responded the only way he knew how: by breaking the massive problem into thousands of smaller ones. He reorganized production into 11 major assemblies and 69 sub-assemblies. He built training schools that operated day and night, teaching riveting sheet metal work, hydraulics, and electrical systems to thousands each week. Willow Run became not only a factory, but an academy of aviation manufacturing, producing both bombers and the workers capable of building them. Progress came slowly, then all at once. In September 1942, after 11 months of struggle, the first complete B-24 rolled out of the plant. It was not ready for combat, and neither were the next 55 aircraft, but each carried lessons that reshaped the production system. Tools improved, workflow stabilized, quality tightened, and gradually a rhythm emerged inside the Willow Run Bomber Factory, the rhythm of a nation learning how to wage industrial war. That rhythm was about to change the world and fulfill the promise of the arsenal of democracy. By early 1943, the slow struggles inside Willow Run began to give way to something extraordinary. Output rose month after month: 31 bombers in January 59 and February 75 in March, 104 in April, 130 in May. The momentum felt less like improvement and more like ignition. The subassemblies moved in synchronized patterns. The mile-long line hummed with a steady pulse. The workers, many of whom had never touched a machine tool before the war, now shaped aluminum with the confidence of veterans. The Willow Run Bomber Factory was finally alive, and Willow Run was not alone. Across the country, a revolution was unfolding. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle turned out B-17 flying fortresses at a pace once thought impossible. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach mass-produced C-47 transports, the backbone of Allied logistics. North American aviation perfected the P-51 Mustang, a fighter whose range would change the air war. Lockheed produced sleek P-38 Lightning's twin boom fighters that screamed across every theater. It was not a collection of factories anymore. It was a network, a living system. Together they formed the true physical shape of the arsenal of democracy, and at its heart was the accelerating rhythm of American aircraft production. The impact reached Europe with terrifying clarity. By mid-1943, German fighter pilots reported bomber formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s guarded by waves of P-47s, and later the long-legged P-51s. Pilots who once claimed air superiority now described the sky as an avalanche. When one bomber fell, two more seemed to take its place the next day. When Germany destroyed a squadron, America replaced it within a week. Industrial war had its own logic, and Germany was beginning to understand it. The starkest lesson came during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched their winter offensive under heavy cloud cover, knowing Allied air power was grounded. For several days, their columns punched through Belgian forests. But on December 23rd, the clouds lifted. Clear skies returned along with the sound of engines. Hundreds of American fighters swept over the front lines. P-47 Thunderbolts dove onto armor columns. P-38 Lightnings hunted supply convoys. B-26 Marauders smashed road junctions and bridges. Heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force left their strategic targets and turned toward the Ardennes, dropping thousands of tons of bomb pressure. Drums across the German positions. More than 74,000 sorties and 111,000 tons of explosives fell in just a few weeks. One German officer described the scene as a sky filled with machines built by a nation we believed could not build them. That belief, rooted in early intelligence reports that dismissed American aircraft production, had become a fatal error. Germany was fighting not just pilots, but factories. It was fighting the speed of retooling, the reach of supply chains, the discipline of the assembly line. It was fighting Willow Run, Seattle, Long Beach, Fort Worth, cities of smoke and steel that never slept. By 1945, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the sky. It could barely rise into it. And overhead flew the machines born from the Willow Run bomber factory, the factories of the West Coast, and the vast engine of the arsenal of democracy machines that made German defeat only a matter of time. Long before victory was visible on any battlefield, a few American leaders understood where the war would truly be won. William Knudsen, once the most powerful industrial executive in the country, became the quiet architect of national mobilization. From Washington, he coordinated thousands of companies, redirecting steel, rubber, aluminum, and labor into a single purpose. In his view, courage and tactics mattered, but the side with deeper factories, faster retooling, and steadier supply chains would shape the final outcome. From that perspective, American aircraft production was not just an industrial achievement. It was a new form of national power. Across the ocean, Germany saw the consequences of misunderstanding that power. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, later wrote that German intelligence failed not because it lacked information, but because it lacked imagination. Reports from America describing assembly lines, tooling upgrades, and the rise of the Willow Run bomber factory were dismissed as exaggerations. Hitler believed quality would defeat quantity. Speer understood too late that quantity could evolve faster than quality could be perfected. The Third Reich, he wrote, was defeated by a flood of material we had no capacity to match. The strategic lesson rippled far beyond Europe. For Britain, Soviet, Russia, and the occupied nations, America's manufacturing surge became proof that industrial democracy could outproduce totalitarian militarism. Roosevelt's phrase, "the arsenal of democracy," was not propaganda, but a description of a global lifeline. Food trucks, locomotives, tanks, ships, and above all, aircraft kept the Allies fighting on multiple fronts. Production itself became a form of diplomacy, a message sent not in words, but in crates, fuel drums, and the steady drone of engines. Today, historians point to this period as the moment modern warfare changed forever. Wars were no longer decided solely by generals' doctrines or elite units. They were decided by throughput, by how quickly a nation could train workers, replace losses, and put new machines into the field. In that sense, American aircraft production was not simply a wartime achievement. It was a demonstration that national survival in the 20th century depended on industrial resilience. The world took notice, and it still does. When the war finally ended and the engines fell silent, the world was left to make sense of what had happened. Factories that once roared day and night began to empty. The long assembly line slowed, then stopped. Workers who had spent years shaping aluminum and steel returned to farms, offices, and small towns. Yet the legacy of those years of the choices made, the risks taken, and the machines built did not fade. It became part of the country's identity, etched into the memory of a generation. The achievement of American aircraft production was measured in numbers: 300,000 aircraft in 4 years, but its meaning lived in quieter moments. In the draftsman who stayed late to redesign a failing component. In the young woman who learned to rivet because her brothers were fighting overseas. In the test pilots who climbed into unfinished bombers trusting the hands of strangers. In the families whose sons flew to Europe in aircraft built by the Willow Run Bomber Factory, Seattle's Plant 2 Long Beach, Fort Worth, and dozens of other places stitched into the industrial fabric of a nation. This was a true shape of the arsenal of democracy, not just steel, but people, ordinary citizens who transformed wartime fear into disciplined, relentless effort. Their work shortened the war, protected the soldiers who carried the fight, and helped end one of the darkest chapters in human history. And their legacy still raises a question worth asking today. What kind of strength must a nation preserve to endure the next great test? For many, that answer lies not only in military hardware, but in the resilience of its industries, the skill of its workers, and the unity of its society when the stakes are highest. The story of American aircraft production is ultimately a reminder that national power grows from individuals who decide that their labor, however small, matters. If this story resonates with you, if you believe the lessons of the arsenal of democracy still speak to the world we live in, consider joining us on this journey. Share your thoughts below. What do you see as the greatest legacy of this era? And what lessons should we carry forward? The war is long over, but the history is still being written. Thank you for watching. The morning sky over New Guinea was a muted sheet of silver, the kind that blurs the horizon and hides danger in its folds. Pilots had learned to fear that kind of sky. For a year, it belonged to the Japanese Zero Fast Agile and undefeated across the Pacific War. On most days, American pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and often outmatched. But on this morning, something felt different. 12 P-38 Lightning fighters rose through the humid air, their twin-boom silhouettes cutting clean lines against the clouds. Among them was a quiet young man from Wisconsin, a pilot whose face still held the softness of farm country, but whose instincts carried a sharpness the Pacific Theater had not yet seen. He said nothing unusual. He made no heroic speech. Yet the moment his P-38's engines settled into their steady roar, the balance of the air war began to shift. Before the day was over, Japanese pilots would speak of an American fighter ace who fought with impossible precision, someone who struck fast, disappeared, and returned from angles no one anticipated. Who was the Peace pilot? And how did he rise from obscurity to become the most feared man in the Pacific sky? Long before the Pacific War carved its scars across the ocean, Richard Bong learned the quiet disciplines that would one day shape an American fighter ace. He grew up in the cold winds and tall pines of northern Wisconsin, on a modest farm where work came with no shortcuts and no excuses. Each morning began with frost on the fields and ended with the quiet hum of rural life, chores, school, the rhythm of a family that valued duty over comfort. It was in 1928, when Bong was 8 years old, that destiny first circled overhead. Mail planes bound for President Calvin Coolidge's summer retreat passed directly above the Bong farm, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Other children might have watched and forgotten. Bong did not. In later letters, he wrote that something in him changed, that summer flying was no longer a dream. It became a direction. By high school, he was known for sharp observation and calm judgment traits, uncommon in someone his age. He excelled academically, but it was his marksmanship and patience in the Wisconsin woods that revealed a deeper instinct and understanding of angles, timing, and the importance of waiting for the perfect moment. These would become the foundations of his aerial combat philosophy. When he joined the civilian pilot training program in 1938, instructors noted a quality that could not be taught. Bong seemed to see the sky differently. He did not merely control an aircraft, he anticipated its behavior. His solo flight on his 20th birthday confirmed it. He handled the Piper Cub with a balance of confidence and humility, absorbing every detail as if the air itself were speaking to him. The world changed in 1941. 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Bong enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. At Luke Field, Arizona, he trained under officers who would later become legends in their own right, including Captain Barry Goldwater. Goldwater remembered him not only for accuracy with a machine gun, but for the analytical mind that evaluated each burst of fire like a mathematician studying an equation. Still, nothing prepared Bong more than the first time he sat inside the cockpit of the P-38 Lightning. Its twin engines growled with a promise of speed and reach unmatched in the Pacific theater. Many pilots feared its complexity. Bong embraced it. He understood immediately that the Lightning's strength's altitude acceleration and concentrated nose-mounted firepower were exactly what an American fighter ace would need against the Japanese Zero. But the Pacific War did not wait for anyone to be fully ready. By mid-1942, Bong found himself on the edge of an air war that America was still struggling to understand. The jungles of New Guinea stretched out beneath him like an endless green wall, and the Japanese Zero owned the sky with brutal confidence. What Richard Bong carried into that theater was not experience. It was something older, disciplined patience, and a young man's quiet belief that courage meant doing one's job even when the odds tilted the wrong way. When Richard Bong arrived in the South Pacific, he stepped into a world where the Japanese Zero dictated every engagement. The Zero was lighter, more agile, and at low altitude nearly untouchable. Many American pilots learned this the hard way. But the Pacific War was changing, and so were the tactics that would decide its future. Initially assigned to a unit flying outdated P-40 Warhawks, Bong was temporarily attached to the 39th Fighter Squadron so he could fly the P-38 Lightning in actual combat. It was a decision that altered the trajectory of the air war. Under Captain Thomas Lynch, a rising tactician in the Pacific Theater, Bong absorbed lessons that would define the next generation of American fighter aces. Never turn with a Japanese Zero. Control altitude. Attack once with purpose, then vanish. On December 27, 1942, he put those lessons into practice for the first time. The sky over Buna was crowded with 40 Japanese aircraft, a mass of bombers guarded by fighters that had ruled the region for a year. Only 12 P-38s rose to meet them. Bong positioned himself above the formation, waited for a small opening, and dove. His first target, a Zero, chasing his commander, disintegrated under a precise burst at close range. His second, a Ki-43 Oscar, fell moments later. Japanese reports later described a twin-boom fighter attacking with a coordination they had not seen before. They did not know the pilot's name, but they felt the shift. Over the next days, Bong engaged in a series of brutal encounters along the New Britain coast. He refused to dogfight in the traditional sense. Instead, he fought vertically, climbing, diving, using the P-38 Lightning's speed to break free from the Zero's turning circle. His fifth kill came during an escort mission, a difficult deflection shot taken at long range while both aircraft twisted violently. It made him an American fighter ace, but it was only the beginning. By April 1943, Bong had earned 10 victories and a reputation for calm, controlled aggression. He fired only when the shot was certain. He never chased too far. And he always returned with the same methodical debrief notes, angles, timing, mistakes, improvements. Pilots began to study him as much as they admired him. Then came July 26, 1943, near Leh. A formation of 20 Japanese fighters approached, followed by 15 more reinforcements. The odds were overwhelming. The smart move, as Bong's own wingman later wrote, would have been to wait for support. Instead, he led 3 successive attacks into the heart of the enemy formation. On his first pass, he destroyed 2 aircraft with short surgical bursts. On the second, he split the formation and claimed 2 more. His wingmen said he seemed to track multiple opponents at once, guiding their movements while executing his own. When the smoke cleared, 10 Japanese aircraft were down. 4 had fallen to Bong. None of the P-38s were lost. It was in battles like these that the legend began. Japanese pilots started warning each other about a twin-boom fighter with red wingtips, a machine flown by a man they called the Ghost. Richard Bong was no longer simply a skilled pilot. He was becoming the most feared American fighter ace in the Pacific War. By the summer of 1943, Richard Bong was no longer just a promising pilot. He was a rising force in the Pacific War. With 15 victories, he was promoted to captain, though he wore the new rank with quiet discomfort. Fame had begun to follow him, carried across the ocean in dispatches that praised an American fighter ace who fought with unmatched precision in the P-38 Lightning. Yet Bong remained focused on the one thing that mattered to him, doing his job and bringing his men home alive. What set him apart was not bravado, but restraint. Many pilots chase glory. Bong chased certainty. He refused to fire unless the shot was perfect. He refused to risk his wingmen for a chance at another kill. In a war that often rewarded aggression, he chose discipline and survived because of it. Then almost abruptly, the war gave him a brief reprieve. In late 1943, General Kenney sent Bong home for rest, though the deeper purpose was clear. Losing America's top prospect in the Pacific would have been a blow to morale. During that leave, Bong met Marjorie Vatndal, a young woman from his home region whose intelligence and warmth disarmed him more thoroughly than any Zero pilot ever could. Their connection was immediate. When Bong returned to combat in 1944, he carried her photograph on the nose of his P-38 Lightning, a gesture that made the aircraft known across the squadron as Marge. It became one of the most recognizable fighters in the Pacific theater. But even symbols are fragile. In March 1944, another pilot flying Marge suffered an engine failure and crashed into the New Guinea jungle. Bong never saw his namesake aircraft again. For a man who rarely revealed emotion, the loss hit deeper than he admitted. Yet he continued flying, mounting Marge's photograph inside the cockpit of whichever Lightning he was assigned. April 1944 marked another turning point. With his 27th victory, he surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record, becoming the highest-scoring American fighter ace in history. Letters poured in, newspapers celebrated him. Life magazine published his photograph. Americans finally had a hero to champion in a war whose early years had felt uncertain. Bong appreciated the praise but wanted none of the spotlight. He wrote to Marge that he felt guilty being away from his squadron, guilty standing on stages while others risked their lives in the Pacific War. Yet the tour achieved its purpose. War bond sales surged, enlistments rose, and workers in American factories found renewed motivation, knowing pilots like Bong depended on their hands. When he returned to the Pacific in late 1944, General Kenney reassigned him to headquarters as an advanced gunnery instructor. He was allowed to fly, but not to seek combat. Bong immediately found the loophole. If combat found him, he could respond. And combat found him often. The skies over the Philippines had become a crucible of desperate resistance. Japanese fighters, dwindling in number, fought with increasing ferocity, and kamikaze attacks pressed American forces to their limits. Through these months, Bong's victories climbed to 30, then 35, and finally 40, all confirmed by gun camera footage and witness reports. His attacks remained the same close-range bursts, 2 or 3 seconds at most, followed by a steep climb out of danger. It was methodical, deadly, and uniquely his. On December 12, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur presented him the Medal of Honor at Tacloban Airfield. 5 days later, Bong scored his 40th kill. Both Kenney and MacArthur agreed his war was over. He had given more than enough. Richard Bong left the Pacific War as America's undisputed ace of aces. But history was not finished with him. From the American perspective, Richard Bong's rise offered something the nation desperately needed: proof that the United States could outthink and outfight a seasoned enemy in the Pacific War. Newspapers called him the Ace of Aces, a title that carried both admiration and weight. Factories hung his photograph near assembly lines. Workers tightening bolts on P-38 Lightning engines reminded one another, this is for men like Bong. In a conflict thousands of miles from home, he became a symbol of American precision, discipline, and quiet resolve. Yet Bong himself never embraced the role. In letters to Marge, he admitted discomfort with public attention. He felt out of place at speeches and ceremonies, believing that the real burden of the war was carried by those who remained in the Pacific theater. This humility only amplified the respect he commanded back home. To many Americans, he represented an ideal, the citizen warrior who fought because duty required it, not because glory beckoned. Across the ocean, however, the name Richard Bong carried a very different meaning. Japanese pilots began warning new aviators about a twin-boom fighter with red wingtips of P-38 Lightning flown by a man they nicknamed the Ghost. After-action reports in the final years of the Pacific War reveal a shift from confidence to anxiety. The Japanese Zero had dominated early battles, but it was designed for maneuverability, not durability. Against Bong's energy tactics, high-altitude approaches, steep diving attacks, and rapid disengagement, the Zero stood little chance. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, later admitted that the appearance of the P-38 changed the psychological balance of the war. American pilots could now choose the terms of engagement. They could strike from above, break contact, and return when conditions favored them. The Japanese Zero was forced into a defensive posture it had never been designed for. Bong's influence extended far beyond his personal victories. His combat reports became instructional material. His close-range firing philosophy, wait close to distance, then fire a controlled burst, was woven into U.S. fighter training doctrine. He demonstrated that air superiority was not won through reckless pursuit, but through preparation, discipline, and analysis under pressure. By late 1944, both sides understood the truth. Richard Bong had reshaped the air war in the Pacific theater. He had become more than an American fighter ace. He was proof that mastery in the sky depended not only on the aircraft, but on the mind guiding it. For Richard Bong, the war ended not in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, but in the quiet sun of a California afternoon. On August 6, 1945, the same day the world learned of Hiroshima, America's greatest fighter pilot, climbed into a jet that represented the future of aviation. The P-80 Shooting Star accelerated down the runway, lifted cleanly, and then faltered. A failing fuel pump, a split-second decision, and too little altitude to survive the fall. After more than 200 missions in the Pacific War, after defeating the Japanese Zero again and again, the ace of aces lost his life. Than sight of home. He was 24 years old. Across the United States, the news felt like a punctuation mark on the war, not triumphant, but somber. Marge Bong, married only 6 months, faced a grief that never fully softened. General Kenny attended the funeral himself, standing beside the family who had sent a quiet Wisconsin farm boy to fight in distant jungles. The community that raised him welcomed him home, but not in the way anyone had hoped. And yet Richard Bong's legacy did not end in that moment. His 40 confirmed victories remain an American record, a testament to a form of aerial combat that has passed into history: close-range gunfights, instinctive maneuvering, and the razor-thin line between survival and loss. Future wars would bring missiles, jets, and split-second engagements, but none would produce an American fighter ace with a tally like his. More important than the number was the method. Bong proved that the sky belonged not to the boldest pilot, but to the most disciplined. He taught that patience could defeat aggression, that preparation could overcome experience, and that protecting one's wingman was as vital as claiming a victory. Long after the Pacific War ended, these lessons shaped generations of American aviators. Today, memorials across the country bear his name. A restored P-38 Lightning stands in Superior, Wisconsin. Its twin booms, a silent reminder of the young man who once ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines. Even in 2024, when the crash site of Marge was rediscovered in the Papua New Guinea jungle, it felt less like an archaeological find and more like the final chapter of a story that still moves people 80 years later. History often remembers wars by their battles, but sometimes it remembers them by the individuals who carried extraordinary burdens with quiet dignity. If Richard Bong's story stays with you, consider sharing what you believe his greatest legacy is. And if you'd like to explore more moments that shaped the Pacific War and the pilots who fought it, I invite you to join us for the next chapter. The morning air over England was cold enough to bite through a flight jacket, and the runway at Debden lay under a thin veil of mist. A young pilot tightened the straps across his shoulders, hearing only the muted rumble of engines warming somewhere down the flight line. He was moments away from a choice few men had ever faced, a flight straight into the heart of a fortress the world believed was unreachable. No one dared say it aloud, but the tension settled over the airfield, like a weight this mission was not supposed to be possible. For years, American bombers had flown deep into German territory and returned shattered. Their gunners outmatched their escorts, forced to turn back long before the danger truly began. The air war over Europe was bleeding men faster than replacements could arrive, and every failed mission pressed the Allies closer to a breaking point. Berlin remained a distant and untouchable shadow, protected by the confidence of German commanders, who believed no long-range escort fighter on Earth could reach it. Berlin remained a distant and untouchable shadow, protected by the confidence of German commanders who believed no long-range escort fighter on Earth could reach it. But on this day, a new shape stood on the ramp, lean, silver, and quiet in its confidence. A machine the Germans insisted could not exist. The P-51 Mustang. What happened next would rewrite the mathematics of survival and the future of the war itself. The story of the P-51 Mustang cannot be understood without first stepping into the desperate months that came before it. Throughout 1943, American bomber crews crossed the English coast, knowing that large portions of the mission would be flown alone, unprotected, and exposed to the waiting claws of Luftwaffe fighters. They called those stretches of sky the Lonely Miles, a quiet name for a deadly truth. When the last friendly escort turned back, the bombers pressed on their formations, tightening as if closeness alone could shield them from what came next. German controllers had studied the limitations of every American fighter in service. They knew exactly where escort range ended, and at that invisible line, the hunting began. Waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s broke through the high clouds and tore into the formations with ruthless precision. In the worst of these assaults over Schweinfurt, over Stuttgart, over the industrial heart of the Reich, dozens of bombers fell in a single day. For the men inside those aluminum fuselages, the air war over Europe became a test of endurance, more than strategy, a battle fought not only with guns, but with the slow rising fear that help would never arrive. The Allies understood the stakes. If deep penetration attacks collapsed the entire bombing campaign, the only means of striking at the German war machine before D-Day would fail. Without daylight pressure on factories, refineries, and railways, the enemy would recover, rebuild, and bleed Allied ground forces when the invasion finally came. The problem was painfully simple. The bombers could fly to the target. Their escorts could not. Thunderbolts lacked the reach. Lightning struggled in the cold. Even the RAF's Spitfire Legendary, in its own right, was tied to the short distances of the Channel front. What the Allies needed was something no one had yet engineered: a long-range escort fighter that could travel hundreds of miles into German airspace fight, protect the bombers, and still return home. German intelligence insisted such an aircraft was impossible. Yet the roots of the answer had already been planted. North American aviation's early Mustang, designed in a whirlwind of wartime urgency, had shown glimpses of something extraordinary: long legs, clean aerodynamics, and fuel efficiency unmatched by other single-engine fighters. It was held back only by the Allison engine, whose power faded in the thin air where bombers flew. Then came the insight that changed everything. What if this nimble airframe, already a natural at conserving fuel, were paired with a high-altitude engine capable of sustaining power above 20,000 feet? Rolls-Royce engineers believed the Merlin could unlock the aircraft's full potential, and when the prototypes roared to life, the transformation was undeniable. Speed climbed ceiling, all surged upward. And more importantly, its range stretched far beyond expectations. In that moment, the foundation was laid for the aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe's certainty and escort bombers deep into Germany. The machine that would make Berlin bombing raids survivable. The machine that would soon be known across Europe as the P-51 Mustang. When the redesigned P-51 Mustang finally entered combat in late 1943, the shift was subtle. At first, a deeper penetration into France. Here is a successful escort run to the German coast there. But to the men studying the charts inside 8th Air Force headquarters, those early missions hinted at something larger. For the first time, a single-engine fighter was matching the distance flown by the bombers. And each time the Mustangs returned, their fuel gauges proved the calculations were real. A door long bolted shut was beginning to open. Major General James Doolittle saw it immediately. If the Allies were to win the air war over Europe, they needed to do more than protect the bombers. They needed to break the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. That meant forcing German pilots into battle again and again until the veteran corps was gone. Only a long-range escort fighter like the Mustang could remain with the bombers long enough to make those fights unavoidable. But aircraft alone never win wars. They require people willing to stretch their limits, and no one embodied that more than Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group. When ordered to convert his unit from Thunderbolts to Mustangs, a transition that normally required weeks, Blakesley answered with the promise he would have the group combat ready in 24 hours. His pilots, veterans of Spitfires and P-47s, learned the cockpit layout on the way to their missions. His ground crews worked through the night by flashlight hands raw from cold metal and safety wire. And when the sun rose, the 4th Fighter Group took off in their new aircraft, each man knowing the next mission would be unlike any they had flown. The test came almost immediately: the first Berlin bombing raids with full escort. The plan was audacious. Fighters would fly ahead, above and around the bombers, forming a moving shield that stretched nearly 70 miles long. As the formations crossed into Germany, contrails appeared in the distance, thin white scars on the blue that marked the arrival of Luftwaffe fighters. The German pilots were climbing fast, preparing to dive through the bomber stream as they had done for years. This time they found Mustangs waiting. The first attack began near 10,000 meters. Blakesley's voice crackled across the radio. Here they come. In moments, the sky dissolved into motion. Spiraling turns, diving streaks of sunlight on aluminum wings, the sudden flash of tracers crossing paths. Mustang pilots turned into the enemy, tightening formation around the bombers. Bf-109s rolled into head-on attacks, but were met by interceptors that could finally match their energy. FW-190s dove through the clouds only to find P-51s in pursuit, the fight extending all the way down to the haze below. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe realized this was no longer the familiar battlefield they had dominated. The escorts weren't turning back, they weren't thinning out. They were growing stronger the farther into Germany they flew. And high above Berlin, as bombs began to fall through the flak-scarred air, it became clear that the P-51 Mustang had done the impossible. It had carried the war all the way to the Nazi capital and was ready to bring its crews home again. The first escorted raids into Berlin stunned German commanders, but the true breaking point followed only days later. On March 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe committed everything. It had veterans pulled from other fronts, reserve units rushed into service, entire fighter wings thrown into the sky in a desperate attempt to crush the American advance. To them, This was the moment to prove that the earlier raid had been a fluke, that a single-engine long-range escort fighter could not possibly endure the full weight of Germany's air defense. What unfolded instead became known as Black Monday. As more than 350 Luftwaffe fighters converged on the bomber stream, the German plan shifted. Rather than attacking the bombers directly, they targeted the escorts. If the P-51s could be scattered or destroyed, the bombers would once again be exposed. It was a brutal logic, and for a brief moment, the sky over central Germany became a tangled arena where survival depended on instinct, discipline, and sheer nerve. The P-51 Mustang pilots met the assault head-on. Major James Goodson broke into an enemy formation, destroying 2 aircraft in seconds. Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey executed tight, aggressive maneuvers that turned German dives into traps. Across the entire defensive screen, similar engagements unfolded. Mustangs diving, climbing, rolling, always positioning between the attackers and the bomber stream behind them. Even when outnumbered, the P-51's energy retention and stability allowed pilots to stay in the fight longer than anything the Germans had faced. But Black Monday carried a heavy cost. 69 bombers fell that day, their wreckage scattered across fields and forests. 11 American fighters were lost. Yet the Luftwaffe lost far more, at least 66 fighters destroyed, many flown by irreplaceable veterans. In the air, war over Europe, this kind of attrition was lethal. Germany could build new aircraft, but it could not manufacture experience fast enough to match the losses. What followed in the days after was not just tactical defeat, but psychological collapse. German aces who had once ruled the sky, men like Gunther Rau and Johannes Steinhoff, returned from combat shaken. They reported being shadowed through turns they had once used to escape, pursued down to the treetops, and caught in dives they believed were safe. One after another, they reached the same conclusion. The Allies had solved the range problem. The escorts were no longer turning back. Every mission would now be a fight from start to finish. As Berlin bombing raids continued, the German system began to unravel. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 200 hours of flight time, a fraction of what was needed for high-altitude combat. Synthetic fuel plants were burning. Transportation networks were fractured. Airfields across Germany suffered repeated strafing attacks where P-51s destroyed the fighters on the ground faster than they could be repaired. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force, once feared across the continent, had been hollowed out. And at the center of that transformation stood the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that turned German certainty into despair and shifted the balance of the war. From Washington to London, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang was recognized as far more than a technical improvement. It was a strategic turning point. To American commanders who had watched bomber crews fall in horrific numbers, the Mustang represented something rare in war, a solution equal to the scale of the problem. General Henry Hap Arnold called its appearance over Germany one of the great miracles of the conflict, a quiet admission that without a true long-range escort fighter, the daylight bombing campaign might have collapsed entirely. Inside 8th Air Force Headquarters, analysts charted the numbers with a mixture of relief and astonishment. Bomber loss rates once catastrophic fell sharply. Targets once considered unreachable, the Ruhr, Leipzig, and eventually the Nazi capital itself now lay within operational range. The air war over Europe was shifting not because the bombers were stronger, but because the skies around them had finally been secured by an aircraft designed to fly farther, fight longer, and bring its pilots home. Across the channel, British commanders saw the Mustang as a reinforcement of a strategy they had pursued since the Battle of Britain: control the air and you control the future. The RAF had proven that fighters could stop an invasion. Now the Americans were proving that fighters could dismantle an empire. The Berlin bombing raids, once symbols of Allied vulnerability, became demonstrations of a new reality. Germany could no longer shield its industrial heartland. In Berlin, the reaction was starkly different. Goering and his staff searched the wreckage of downed Mustangs, convinced the Americans had deployed some hidden technology. Their engineers found nothing revolutionary, just clean aerodynamics, disciplined fuel management, and a design that quietly prioritized range from the beginning. The shock was not simply that American fighters had reached Berlin. It was that they could do it again and again, draining the strength of Luftwaffe fighters every time they appeared. Other nations watching from afar drew their own conclusions. Allied planners understood that the Mustang validated a universal truth of modern warfare: mobility and reach matter more than raw power alone. Neutral observers recognized that Germany's presumed dominance in the air had been an illusion sustained by geography. Once that advantage disappeared, so did the Luftwaffe's ability to influence events on the ground. In the end, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort Buyers. It reshaped strategic thinking across continents, proving that in a conflict as vast as World War II, the side that can reach the farthest often decides how and when the war will end. When historians look back at the great turning points of the Second World War, they often focus on the beaches, the cities, the armies that clashed on the ground. But some of the most decisive moments unfolded far above them in thin, freezing air where oxygen was scarce and decisions were measured in seconds. It was there, high above a wounded continent, that the P-51 Mustang quietly altered the direction of history. The Mustang did not win because it was the fastest aircraft or the most heavily armed. It won because it could be there over the Ruhr, over Leipzig, and finally over the Nazi capital, when no other Allied fighter could. By solving the range problem, it solved the strategic problem. Every successful escort run weakened the core of Luftwaffe fighters. Every return flight proved that the long-feared deep raids could be sustained. And every reduction in bomber losses allowed the Allied offensive to continue pressing inward, dismantling Germany's ability to wage modern war. In the long memory of the air war over Europe, the Mustang's legacy extends beyond performance statistics or battlefield victories. It transformed how nations thought about air power. Military planners learned that a true long-range escort fighter is not a luxury, it is a prerequisite for any campaign that seeks to strike deep and return alive. That lesson shaped the design philosophy of generations of fighters that followed, all tracing their lineage back to a machine that once defied German intelligence reports. But its greatest legacy may be written in quieter moments. In the faces of bomber crews who once flew into Germany believing they would never return, and who looked out their windows to see silver wings sliding into formation beside them. In the hands of ground crews who worked through rain and darkness, so those same aircraft would be ready at dawn. And in the memory of pilots who carried the weight of 6-hour missions, knowing that a single mistake could leave them alone over hostile territory. In the end, the Berlin bombing raids succeeded not simply because of machinery, but because ordinary men, engineers, mechanics, strategists, and pilots refused to accept the limits placed before them. As you reflect on this story, consider the larger question it raises. What lessons from that distant sky still matter today? And how often do we underestimate the power of solving the right problem at the right time? If this chapter of history speaks to you, I invite you to share your thoughts or stories in the comments. And if you value remembering moments that shaped our world, consider joining us for the next journey into the past. The war may have ended long ago, but the legacy of the P-51 Mustang still flies. There are moments in war when a pilot sits alone with a machine and realizes the next few seconds may decide not only his fate, but the fate of every man who will ever fly that aircraft again. In February 1944, as winter winds scraped across the Bell Aircraft Factory in Buffalo, a Soviet test pilot lowered himself into the cockpit of an American machine he barely trusted. The engineers around him argued quietly, tensely about whether this flight might kill him. They spoke of numbers, tolerances, margins of safety. But Andrei Kochetkov had flown enough aircraft to know when something felt wrong. And this one felt wrong. What he sat inside would become known as the P-63 King Cobra, an American World War II fighter built not for American pilots, but for men fighting half a world away. On paper, it promised to be everything its troubled predecessor, the P-39 Air Cobra, was not. In reality, no one yet knew the truth. Was it a savior or another coffin with wings? Before we can understand whether the P-63 deserves a place among the great World War II dogfighters, we must follow the man who dared to test it at the edge of a spin that almost took his life. War has a way of exposing the truth about machines. On the Eastern Front, that truth had been brutal. Long before the P-63 King Cobra appeared, Soviet pilots had learned to fear its predecessor, the P-39 Air Cobra, another American World War II fighter whose design placed the engine behind the cockpit and the cannon through the propeller hub. At low altitude, it was fast, heavily armed, and capable of killing German fighters with a single, well-placed burst. But it carried a hidden flaw, one that revealed itself without warning: a vicious, unrecoverable flat spin. To Soviet pilots, the Air Cobra was both a weapon and a gamble. They respected its firepower, even admired its rugged frame and warm cockpit during the minus 40-degree winters. Yet they flew it knowing that a simple mistake, an over-aggressive maneuver, a momentary lapse while chasing a Messerschmitt could send the aircraft flipping into a spin no pilot could escape. Doors jammed, controls locked. Stories spread across regiments about men who never returned from routine training flights. The Air Cobra earned a grim nickname, the Flying Coffin. Still, the Soviets kept flying it. They had no choice. In 1943, they were fighting for survival against the Luftwaffe, and every fighter Soviet built or Lend-Lease was thrown into the sky. Officially, the P-39 was supposed to be used only in the Far East under the Lend-Lease agreement, not against Germany. Unofficially, entire regiments slipped them into combat on the Western Front. German pilots began reporting encounters with unfamiliar mid-engine fighters. Some thought they were captured American aircraft. Others believed the Americans were secretly aiding the Soviets. The truth was simpler. The Red Air Force was desperate, and desperation ignores paperwork. So when Bell Aircraft introduced a new machine, a supposedly improved successor to the Air Cobra, the Soviet Union paid attention. The new fighter was larger, stronger, more powerful. Its name would be P-63 King Cobra. And on paper, it promised to fix the Air Cobra's worst sins: better high-altitude performance, improved handling, stronger structure, and refined weaponry. America tested it, compared it to the P-51 Mustang, and decided it did not meet their needs. For American doctrine for long-range escort, the Mustang was king. So the United States ordered the P-63 into production, mostly for export. The Soviets refused to accept it blindly. They had lost too many pilots to spin accidents to trust any mid-engine design again. They insisted on sending their own experts, men who would not be swayed by charts or optimistic test reports. One was engineer Fedor Saprun, a man who understood how a few misplaced kilograms could doom a fighter. The other was the calm, sharp-minded pilot Andrei Kochetkov, already veteran of more than 2,000 flight hours, a man unafraid to push an aircraft until it either obeyed or tried to kill him. Together they traveled to Buffalo, New York, not to praise a new marvel of aviation, but to find out whether this American World War II fighter would save Soviet lives or become the next tragedy disguised as a World War II dogfighter. When Andrei Kochetkov first lifted the P-63 King Cobra off the runway at Buffalo, the fighter seemed eager to impress. It climbed cleanly, rolled smoothly, and responded with the crispness expected of a new American World War II fighter. Yet beneath the polished surface, something felt unsettled. Kochetkov described it later as a subtle weight behind him, a whisper of imbalance, rather than a shout, just enough to warn a seasoned pilot that this aircraft carried secrets. He knew the next step was unavoidable. The Soviet Air Force needed to understand the aircraft's behavior at the edge of the envelope, where a true World War II dogfighter either proves itself or betrays its pilot. Either. So Kochetkov requested spin testing. Bell's engineers resisted. The aircraft had already passed American evaluations. It wasn't meant to fight for the United States, so why risk damaging it? But Kochetkov insisted, and eventually the Americans relented, cautiously, reluctantly. At 12,000 feet, he pulled the P-63 into a deliberate spin entry rudder and power-reduced nose dropping into rotation. The first seconds were routine. Then the routine ended. As Kochetkov applied recovery controls opposite rudder forward stick, the aircraft ignored him. The spin flattened. The nose refused to drop. The world outside began to circle in a wide, sickening rotation, silent except for the growing strain in the airframe. He tried again. Full opposite rudder, forward stick to the limit. Neutral ailerons. Nothing. The P-63 King Cobra wasn't recovering. It was sinking in a wide, deadly spiral, the same kind that had killed so many P-39 pilots. The structure creaked under the loads as though the tail were being twisted apart. At 5,000 feet, Kochetkov prepared to bail out. He reached for the door handle, knowing all too well that the centrifugal force might trap him inside. And then suddenly the nose dropped. Not because of anything he had done, simply because the airflow changed as he fell through the sky. The King Cobra pulled itself out of the spin just in time. Back on the ground, Bell's engineers inspected the fighter and found what Kochetkov already knew. The rear fuselage had buckled. The metal had bent under stress that the aircraft should have survived. Saprun studied the design data and revealed the deeper truth. The center of gravity, once fuel and ammunition were added, shifted too far aft. In a spin, the mass behind the cockpit overpowered the pilot's control authority. No skill could fix physics. What followed was an unusual partnership. American engineers and Soviet specialists worked side by side to reposition equipment, add ballast, reinforce structure, improve armor, move the cannon forward, and expand ammunition supply. When Kochetkov tested the modified model, the fighter behaved differently. Still tail-heavy but predictable. It no longer tried to kill him. For the first time, the P-63 King Cobra felt like what it was meant to be: a rugged, maneuverable American World War II fighter, ready to become a formidable World War II dogfighter, but only after being reshaped by the men who had nearly died discovering its flaws. The journey of the P-63 King Cobra did not end on a test range in Buffalo. For Soviet pilots to fly it in war, the aircraft had to survive a far harsher trial. One fought not against enemy fighters, but against the brutal, indifferent geography of the far north. The ferry route that carried the King Cobra from America to the Soviet Union was one of the most dangerous air corridors of the Second World War. Pilots took off from Buffalo and crossed the continental United States before turning north through Canada. From Edmonton to Fort Nelson, from Watson Lake to Whitehorse, the airfields were little more than outposts carved into wilderness. Navigation aids were primitive. Weather changed without warning. Clouds swallowed mountain peaks whole. Many of the men ferrying these machines were young Americans who had never flown in such conditions. Engines failed in sub-zero temperatures. Aircraft vanished into valleys wrapped in fog. Some pilots simply disappeared across the northwest staging route, their American World War II fighter buried forever under snow and rock. Then came Alaska Fairbanks, then Nome, and beyond it, the most unforgiving stretch of all, the Bering Strait. 55 miles of freezing water, no emergency landing sites, no reliable radio guidance. If a pilot went down here, he lasted minutes. Soviet crews took over at Fairbanks, flying the final leg into Siberia, where even the airfields themselves were hazards, icy runways, crude maintenance, and storms that could trap aircraft for days. By late 1944, hundreds of P-63 King Cobra fighters reached Soviet territory. Officially, they were destined for the Far East. Unofficially, whispers began to circulate reports from German pilots claiming to see unfamiliar mid-engine fighters over East Prussia and the Courland pocket. Soviet memoirs written decades later hinted that some elite regiments quietly replaced their P-39s with the improved King Cobras. No paperwork confirmed it, but battles rarely wait for bureaucracy, and war often leaves its traces in memory rather than archives. What history can confirm is that in August 1945, the King Cobra finally fought openly. When the Soviet Union launched its massive offensive against Japan in Manchuria and northern Korea, the P-63 went into combat at low altitude at its natural domain. Here, the aircraft became the World War II dogfighter it was meant to be. Its roll rate allowed lightning-fast reversals. Its armor saved pilots who flew through small arms fire. Its 37mm cannon shattered Japanese aircraft and tore apart ground targets with brutal efficiency. One engagement stands out. Lieutenant Myron Nichenko led a flight of P-63s over the Sea of Japan. Spotting Ki-43 Hayabusas escorting bombers, he attacked from above. His first burst cannon and .50 caliber fire blew a Japanese fighter apart. When another dove on him, he snapped into a hard left roll using the King Cobra's unmatched agility to meet the attacker head-on. Both pilots fired. Bullets tore into Nichenko's wing, but his own rounds struck the enemy's engine, sending it trailing smoke as it fled. By the end of the Manchurian campaign, the P-63 King Cobra had proven itself in roles America never envisioned. Rugged, lethal at low altitude, flexible enough to fight to escort to strike. A true American World War II fighter, but one whose legacy belonged almost entirely to another nation. In the United States, the story of the P-63 King Cobra unfolded along a very different path. To American planners, the war in the skies demanded high-altitude endurance fighters that could shepherd bomber formations deep into Germany and back. For that mission, the P-51 Mustang reigned without challenge. It was faster, more efficient, and ideally suited to the long-range escort role. Within that framework, the King Cobra never had a chance. It was judged by standards it wasn't designed to meet, and so the United States quietly set it aside. But America still found a use for this unusual American World War II fighter. If it would not fight in Europe or the Pacific, it would be flown in one of the most dangerous training programs ever devised, Operation Pinball. Here, specially modified RP-63s became armored bright orange flying targets, used to train the gunners who defended B-17s and B-25s. The concept was simple. The reality was anything but. As gunners fired frangible .50 caliber rounds, pilots inside the RP-63s felt every strike reverberate like a hammer against steel. Even with heavy armor, mistakes could be fatal. Yet Operation Pinball saved lives. Hit rates improved dramatically, and bomber crews learned discipline under fire. In this unexpected role, the P-63 King Cobra became part of a chain of survival stretching across continents. Meanwhile, the broader world struggled to place the aircraft within the hierarchy of wartime aviation. In the West, it lacked the glamour of the Mustang or Thunderbolt. It produced no celebrated aces, no iconic photographs, no headlines. The Soviets, for their part, buried much of the King Cobra's combat record behind Cold War secrecy. They downplayed Lend-Lease support, minimized American contributions, and allowed the aircraft's role to fade into shadows. Yet when historians examine the fragments, German reports describing unfamiliar fighters, Soviet veterans recalling machines that defied official records, Japanese accounts of low-altitude battles in Manchuria, a different picture emerges. The King Cobra may not have shaped American air doctrine, but it profoundly shaped Soviet operations in the final phase of the war. From the American viewpoint, the P-63 King Cobra was an unproven concept, overshadowed by better-known designs. From the Soviet viewpoint, it was a rugged, maneuverable World War II dogfighter that arrived at the right moment and did exactly what their battlefield demanded. And from a global viewpoint, it remains a reminder that the success of an aircraft sometimes depends less on where it was built and more on where it was needed. In the end, the story of the P-63 King Cobra is not the story of an aircraft that won headlines or carved its name into the great air battles of Europe. It is the story of a machine whose value was revealed quietly through the hands of test pilots. The calculations of engineers, the courage of ferry crews crossing frozen wilderness, and the determination of Soviet aviators who learned to fight with it at treetop height. It was shaped not by glory, but by necessity. When we ask whether it was the best American World War II fighter, we must first ask what best means. For the United States, with its need for long-range escorts, powerful high-altitude performance, and global logistics, the answer was simple. The P-51 Mustang was unmatched. The King Cobra could not compete in that arena. It was never meant to. But war is not one arena, it is many. On the Eastern Front, where battles unfolded, below 10,000 feet, where agility mattered more than altitude, where survival often depended on rugged construction and decisive bursts of firepower, the equation changed. In those conditions, the P-63 King Cobra became something else entirely. A knife-sharp turner, a fast roller, a durable attacker, a World War II dogfighter built in America, but perfected through Soviet experience. Its legacy is not measured in kill scores or aces. It is measured in the Soviet pilots who came home because the aircraft no longer spun them into the ground. It is measured in the American gunners who survived combat after training against glowing orange RP-63s. It is measured in the unlikely partnership between two nations whose cooperation was temporary tactical and yet in this case life-saving. History often remembers the pilots who shot the enemy down. It remembers fewer of those who prevented machines from killing their own men. Andrei Kochetkov never received medals or public honor for discovering the flaw that nearly cost him his life. Yet his insistence on truth hands on the control's mind against the numbers saved countless others. His legacy lives inside every King Cobra that flew safely because he refused to look away. So was the P-63 King Cobra, the best American dogfighter of the war. Perhaps not for America, but for the battlefield it truly belonged to, for the men who trusted it at low altitude, who fought with it and survived because of it. It might have been exactly the machine they needed. If this story resonates with you, we invite you to share your thoughts. Did the King Cobra earn its place among the great fighters of the Second World War? Your perspective matters and your voice helps keep these histories alive. There are moments in war when a pilot sits alone with a machine and realizes the next few seconds may decide not only his fate, but the fate of every man who will ever fly that aircraft again. In February 1944, as winter winds scraped across the Bell Aircraft Factory in Buffalo, a Soviet test pilot lowered himself into the cockpit of an American machine he barely trusted. The engineers around him argued quietly, tensely about whether this flight might kill him. They spoke of numbers tolerances,